So this is our second webinar in our series for Small Flock Poultry Fundamentals for Extension and Veterinary Professionals. Today we will be talking about poultry for biology for non-specialists, and we have my colleague Dr. Victoria Uyenga, who will be here to give her presentation. I will spotlight her and I will turn everything over to her. She can share her screen.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Small Flock Poultry Fundamentals, like Dr. Fisher has just introduced us to. Today, we're going to be having the second part of this webinar, and it's on poultry biology for non-specialists. So, the series was developed to provide with research-based information for our professionals that work with the small flock poultry. But before we get started, just in the interest of time, we'll have the questions and discussions come up at the end of this presentation. However, if you have some questions while the presentation is going on, please drop them in the chat box and we can get to it. Now, whether you're joining us live or you're watching the recording later, thanks for being here. We hope that this series will provide you with the practical tools and resources that you can apply in your own work and then build your own small poultry flock enterprise in your own different communities. So as acknowledgements, we'd like to acknowledge the support that made this educational series possible. The materials is based on the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, U.S. Department of Agriculture, through the North Central Region Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education, or the SARE program, under project number ENC 23223. The full funding acknowledgements and required USDA statement is provided on this slide for your reference, and we are grateful for their support in helping us develop this educational resource for veterinary and extension professionals serving small flock poultry producers. As a disclaimer, I would like to bring up these few points that firstly, Lincoln University is an equal opportunity employer and provider. As such, does not discriminate in its educational programs, activities, services, admission, or employment practices based on the protected characteristics as outlined in this slide. Secondly, throughout this presentation, you may see some references to specific product, equipment, or brand names. These are strictly for educational purposes, and as such should not be interpreted as endorsement by Lincoln University or our project partners. And finally, while today's presentation is developed using current research and best practices, this information is intended for educational purposes only. It's not a substitute for your veterinary medical advice, the diagnosis, or treatment of individual animals. So specific flock health concerns should always be addressed through an established veterinarian client-patient relationship. So with these housekeeping items covered, let's begin our discussion for today, which is on poultry biology for non-specialists. The goal of today's webinar is to provide you with that foundational understanding that you need with regards to understanding the anatomy, the physiology, behavior, species-specific information that will help to interpret your concerns and also support production decisions and informed recommendations for the common poultry species. So I'm your speaker, Victoria Uyenga, and a brief bio on my end. Can I still be heard? So a brief bio on my end. Yes, I am an assistant professor of animal science at Lincoln University. And I came in as an international scholar, but I've been at Lincoln since October of 2024. And I enjoy working with various poultry species. The chart here simply provides a timeline of my journey in the field of poultry science. And I think I've worked with poultry species for the last decade. So my work essentially generates translational research that cuts across nutrition, physiology, welfare, with the goal of generating significant impact on the productive outcomes which would benefit both the commercial producers and the small scale poultry producers. As such, I'm currently working with our extension team at LU, that's Lincoln University, to share what our extension programs have developed and how this would best serve our growing audience of small flock poultry producers. So for today's webinar now, it's our intention that by the end of this presentation, participants will be able to understand what poultry biology relates to, its importance and practical applications, identify the major features, structures, and functions of the avian biological system, look into some species-specific differences that cut across the poultry or avian species and then the mammalian biology, and then how these different systems could be beneficial for production decision making. And before we jump into the content, we're going to be looking at what is poultry biology and then why is this important? From our basic knowledge, especially if you've been in the STEM field, once you hear that word biology, right, two things come to mind: structure and function. So in today's webinar, we're talking poultry biology, and that relates to looking into the anatomy and the physiology of our domesticated birds. From last week's webinar, we had that understanding of that broad term, that poultry is a broad term which relates to domesticated birds. So most of us will be familiar with chickens, but we're going to be discussing other species, including turkeys, duck, geese, and looking at how those species-specific information come into play and what makes them distinct. Now, why are we looking at this? Why is it important? I find that if you know what is the normal, then it will be easy for you to pick up what is abnormal. So having that knowledge of the anatomy and physiology is essential to understand the bird that you're working with and also correct or be able to implement practices that would alleviate any concerns when problems arise. For instance, if you have knowledge of how the skeletal system is supposed to be, if you're encountering maybe deformities, you would be easy to identify and also make corrections. Knowledge of the digestive system would help you to understand the nutritive requirements of your birds, and so on and forth. So for today's discussion, we will be looking at two core parts, first being the external features before going into the internal features and systems. Now, I understand that this particular topic is meant for non-specialists. So we would be developing from the known to the unknown. But typically, when we're looking at identification, we're looking at those external features or physical properties that you'll be easily identify or pinpoint. And that takes us to identification of your rooster or the hen. So you'll be looking at some of the basic external parts, which you would find. Our typical model is going to be the chicken, but as we go on, we'll get to look at other poultry species. So the basic external parts would include what you would have on the upper body versus what you have on the lower parts of the body. And the upper part, you would have the comb, you would have the beak, you would have the eyes, the wings, the tails, all that are some things you can pick out on the external. And I want to presume that most of us, especially if you are a small flock poultry producer, you may be able to distinguish between your males and your females. This might be obvious for some breeds relative to some, but some of those things that stand out to be in terms of the body size, whereby some males may be bigger than the females, or the size of the comb, the size of the wattles, or the size of the spurs, especially in older birds. Another key feature there is the feathers. So for the male, you have the hackle feathers and the cape feathers having pointed ends. But for the females, these are typically rounded ends. More so for the males, you would have these sickle feathers. For the upper part of the body, we're just going to look at the head, right? And some of those things on the external anatomy that stand out. So this is your chicken head, and we have the comb, the eyes, the ears, the earlobe, the wattles, and we also have the beak. The comb and the wattle, these are protrusions, red growth found either at the crown of the head, whereas the wattle is found underneath the beak. They serve various functions, especially with body temperature regulation, and they are also a sign of health. So, having the comb, having the wattle, these are key features on the head, and they have physiological roles. The mouth or the beak obviously serves as the chicken mouth for feeding, grooming, self-defense. I remember one of my young ones asking, does the chicken have an ear? They have an ear hole, but then this looks almost covered by the feathers. That is important for them to be able to detect sounds and pick up external stimuli. They also have the earlobe, which is that fold of skin beneath this ear hole. So the way this works, we have the head containing these sensory organs, and these sensory organs play an important role in the day-to-day functioning of the animal. It works along with the nervous system. It integrates external stimuli, detects the stimuli from the bird's environment, and allows the bird to respond to this. So the first sensory organ we're looking at there is the eyes, the sight. For the birds or poultry, we have the upper eyelid, we have the lower eyelid. But what's interesting is that the eyes help in sight, and they have both binocular as well as monocular vision. So with the binocular, they are able to use both eyes combined, right, to have a enhanced depth of vision. And this is very important when they're trying to forage. For the monocular vision, this one is more important in terms of predator watch and being able to defend or flee in terms of the fight or flight syndrome. This membrane here is the nictating membrane, which is also having a kind of protective role in that it can easily reach into the corner of the eye to cover the eyeballs. And that is also very unique for your chickens. The second thing there is hearing. As I mentioned earlier, we have the earlobe and then we have the ear opening. Poultry, they're able to pick up sounds, especially sound waves, and this applies as pressure on the tympanic membrane. So the auditory nerves, they pick up this sound, it gets to the brain where it's being recognized as sound. So they have a good sense of hearing and are able to pick up this information. The nostrils are also present. They don't have a typical nose like your mammals, but they have the nostril and the nares. But aside from these, their olfactory organ is not very highly developed. And in terms of smell, this is seen as a secondary sense, which it can help in terms of location or choice of food. And for the taste buds, that is also present. It's located at the base of the tongue, not as developed as in mammals because birds have maybe about 300 taste buds relative to humans, which have almost 10,000. They can pick up some taste, but then like sweetness or bitterness, they are indifferent to this taste. So obviously within the head, we have these key sense organs and they have various functions helping with the day-to-day survival of the bird and its ability to carry out normal physiological functions. One of the key things that we looked at was the comb when we're looking at the external parts, and does that red growth on the crown. So for our small flocks, we come into different breeds, heritage breeds that several farmers are more convenient with, and some common types of combs we may encounter at these 8 types that we have here with the different representative breeds. So you can have the buttercup, the cushion, pea comb, rose comb, the single comb. This is the most dominant and common that you would find with your poultry breeds currently. The strawberry, the V comb, or the walnuts that you can find in your silky breed. So the comb is a very prominent feature that you'll find on the head of your chicken, and these are just the common types of combs. But then in production practice, this might not be typical here in the US, but in some places we have a management practice known as dubbing. And with dubbing, this includes trimming of the comb and sometimes the wattle. This can be done to reduce aggressiveness in birds or minimizing fighting, and also as a way to prevent frostbite in cold environments. So those are some features, at least if you're looking at the upper part of the body, you have the comb, the sensory organs on the head, we have the wattles, the beak, and all that. If we're now looking at the lower body, then we'll be having the thigh, the shank, the spur, the claw, and the lower body also serves important benefits in that it provides that support. It's able to assist with locomotion, is also able to assist with movement of the bird. But a key thing I want us to see there is the legs. So to the left, we have the rooster's leg, and to the right, we have the hen's leg. They're able to stand, they're able to walk, they're able to move around. But then there are some distinguishing features here because on the roosters, you have the spur, which is also important as a defensive uh, mechanism. But then on the hen's parts, you'd have the projection of the toes and typically not the spurs. Another key feature of the legs are the scales. The scales are located on the legs and on the feet, and oftentimes they may be yellow in color, but for some commercial chicken strains, they have yellow legs, but then our heritage breeds, these colors may differ across maybe different colors that we come into. Still on the external anatomy, the feathers. For the chicken body, about a large portion of the surface area, up to 70%, is covered just by the feathers. And these serve critical role in helping to protect, providing that insulative cover, providing a source of for their mating display to attract a mate, assist in temperature regulation. This is also very important. So for the major types of feathers we come into, that would be the contour, the plumels, philoplumels, bristles, and the down feather. Most of their role is to provide a way of trapping in insulating the bird. And for something like your chick, your day-old chicks, we have the down feathers, which would help to conserve that body heat and help with their thermoregulation. The bristle feather, this is what you would typically have around the eye of the bird, and it's supposed to help also. It has a sensory ability, providing it with that sensation and picking up of external stimuli. Then for a small flock, some feather patterns may be obvious depending on the breed that you're using. And some of the feather patterns we run into would be the single lace, the double laced, pencil, the barred, mottling, and spangling. This is just information that I'm putting out there. So if you have a particular breed of chicken that you're working with, you could try to identify, oh, what kind of feather patterns does this bird have? But some of the characteristic features you can observe: the single laced, the black outer cover followed by the inner white spots, or the spangled, which is characterized with the black dotted points and then the whites in the middle followed by the black. So these feather colors and patterns, they differ with the different breeds that we work with. Still looking at those things that we find on the external part of the poultry, or in this case, our chicken model, we have the skin and we have the feathers. Since we are talking about poultry biology, collectively, the skin and the feathers form what we know as the integumentary system. The function of this integumentary system is to protect the bird, to help with temperature regulation, to act as receptors, picking up the external stimuli and being able to translate that, help with flight. So it plays a significant role in that bird's productivity, survival, and then ability to continue with its day-to-day functioning. So we've looked at feathers, and now I'll just be talking briefly on the skin. When you look at your bird, or whether it's the chicken that you have, the skin has different areas. Some parts are covered with feathers, some parts are not feathered. Some parts have the scales, like the lower legs and the feet. Some have hard honey structures, like the beak, the toenails, parts on the feet, the skin of the comb and wattles, which is pretty unique. So the poultry skin is not uniform, but then has different structures, different areas, which assist with the varied functions that the bird needs to do. But what is particularly unique is that there are no sweat glands on the poultry skin, which makes because the ability to thermoregulate is more a bit trickish in that the absence of sweat glands, the feather serving as an insulative cover, that makes it a bit more difficult for birds to easily thermoregulate, which we'll look at when we are looking at the thermoregulatory system. But another thing that stands out there is the preen gland, also known as the uropygial gland. And the preen glands acts as a source of oil, which the bird, during that process of preening, they're using the beak scratching through, getting that oil and rubbing it through the feathers, can serve as a protective defense and also helps in grooming. So the skin is also very thin if you're comparing it to mammals. All these serve as distinguishing features for the poultry skin. So we had taken the chicken as a model and discussed on some of those things. Now, what about other poultry species? What makes them stand out? And the first one we're looking at there is the turkey. In terms of external anatomy, they have some of those similar basic features. The eyes are there, the ears, the beak is present. But what makes it distinguished? And for the turkey, they don't have the comb on the head, unlike what we saw with the chicken. However, they have the snoot, which is this fleshy growth from the base of the beak. They also have the caruncles. The caruncles here is this fleshy growth that we have all along the neck and the head. Now, for the tongue, sometimes they have, especially the matured ones, they have these bristle-like fibers, which is the beard. That tuft is referred to as the turkey beard. So this makes it stand out as its own poultry species. For the duck, they also have similar external features, but then its unique characteristic would be the bill that it has, and the bill is flatter than the beak of the chicken. They also have the bean, which is that protrusion on the upper lip. They have the webbed toes, which helps with swimming. And for the males, if you're trying to distinguish the males from the males have these curly feathers, which is known as the sex feathers, whereas for the females, they don't have that. Still looking at other poultry species, the geese, some breeds have some features that others do not. But for this particular one, they have the honey knob here, which is very distinct. The bill or the base of the bill, they also have that provided. They have the dewlap, which is that loose growth extending from the base of the throat. The guinea fowl. The helmeted guinea fowl is the most common species, and they have this bony protrusion on the head known as the helmet, which is very characteristic of this particular species. And another feature that makes it stand out is the skin, the head cap skin, which you can see here folding through on the head. The next group there is the ratites, and the ratites, these are, I'll describe them as bigger birds and flightless birds. So unlike your chicken that have the keel bone, the ratites don't have the keel bone, which is the breastbone. So they don't fly as such as we'll have for your chickens or turkeys or ducks that have the keel bone. This would include your ostrich, your ree, or your emu. So we just had some discussion through what is found on the upper body, what is found on the lower body, and then we looked at some distinguishing features of different poultry species. And to continue, we just have this short question that says, for the different poultry species we just looked at with those images, which of these is likely to have the dewlap? Remember, the dewlap is that loose growth of skin that is found at the base of the lower bill or the upper throat. So is it the turkey, the geese, your chicken, guinea fowl, ducks, or emu? Now, this is where you go into the chat box and let's see how many of you have been following so far. So which of these poultry species has this characteristic feature known as the dewlap? We're going to give a few seconds and I'll be looking at the chat box to see what suggestions we have. I would have loved to use pool for these, but turkey, geese, okay. Okay, we have 3 for turkey, 2 for geese. All right, and I feel some other persons are still trying to think about it, but yes, on that we have the geese, and that's that dewlap, which is that protrusion that we have on the base of the neck. So thank you for engaging. That tells us that the lesson is progressing. So with this knowledge that we have on the external parts of the bird, how does this come in terms of production decision? And one of the questions that might come in there is just based on the external features, right? Especially if you're into egg production, how would you know which bird is a good layer? There are so many ways to go about this. So many factors to consider, but let's just look at based on the external anatomy. You could decide to evaluate the bird as a flock, right? Which you could use parameters like your hen house egg production or hen day egg production. But if you're looking at individual performance, then being able to examine the bird's ability to lay or the past productive records would be beneficial. And some of these criteria that could help make these decisions would be the pigmentation of the skin, the plumage condition, and if that bird is molting, which you can easily identify, or the constitution and body condition of that bird. So for the skin pigmentation, especially for our commercial birds, they are typically yellow skinned, and this is due to pigmentation from the meals, the carotenes that you can easily get from your corn and other sources of nutrients. This gets deposited in areas like the skin, the beak, the eye, the ring, shank, and toes. So for your new laying hens, they would have a darker or that dark yellow color in those areas. But once they start laying, that pigment gradually gets faded as it's being deposited into the yolk or other parts of the skin. So there's that gradual bleaching, which is also a unique feature that helps you identify, is this bird a good producer or not? So if you're looking at the face, for a good producer, you'll be looking at the eye ring, you'll be looking at the beak and the earlobe. The yellow pigments would bleach for your good producers, and this can be used to identify a good or poor layer. The head with no pigments tells you that's a good producer. The head with for a poorer egg producer would show that pigments remaining in the beak or the eye area. Another area to look out for would be the vent, which this shows a bleached area for a good producer relative to a poor producer where you can still see that yellowish pigmentation. For the plumage condition, this is also a good indicator of the molting status of the hen. So when a hen is molting, they may start losing feathers from the axial. The axial is basically that feather that separates between your primary feathers, which might rank from 1 to 10 as shown here, relative to the secondary feathers. So hens that are growing new feathers typically are not usually laying eggs. Essentially, by examining the plumage condition, that can tell you, is that hen actively laying or not? The legs, the feet and the legs is also another key area to look out for when looking at skin pigmentation. So we started with the face, the vent, and now the legs. So for a good producer, that yellowishness is going to be bleached out relative to your poor producer, where you'll still have some of that on the scales of the legs and the feet. And this leads us to our next practice question, where we have cage. This is just cage 1, 2, 3, 4. And this practice there is rank the following hens from what you think would be the best producer to the poorest producer. Now we are only considering the skin pigmentation on the legs. So based on how that is washing out or how that is bleaching, which of these do you think is going to be the best producing hen down to which one do you think is going to be like the poorest? And let's see how that comes up. So please feel free to use the chat button and put in your suggestions. Is it cage one? Is it two, three, four? Or which comes first? Which is the poorest? Which is the best? Okay, 3142. All right. I'm seeing some very interesting suggestions now. We have 3124, 3124, and 3142. So what I'm getting, at least everybody agrees that three is like the best producer, right? Then after three, that's closely followed by one. And then we are having four and then two. So some people are going for four before two, and some are going for two before four. Well, this is an interesting index because you want to look at just the legs, but then that tells us that we need more than having the skin pigmentation on the legs to uh, decisively tell, okay, is it a good producer or not? But just based on this information, I would go with two before four because if you're looking at the front side as well as the back side, you could see some of those contrasts in terms of the yellowishness. But yes, this is also a way that you could use the external anatomy of the birds to help with your production decisions. So that kind of sums up on the external parts. For the internal parts, we have several parts of the system when we're talking of poultry biology. I'll just try to shed some insight into that because this is a non-specialist discussion we are having. We've talked on the sensory organs, on the integumentary system, and I'll try to look into the skeletal, thermoregulatory, excretory, and circulatory. Other parts of this webinar for coming weeks is going to cover digestive, reproductive, and some other interesting topics, and I'll encourage you to be available for those. But in terms of the skeletal system, we understand the skeletal system is very important, providing the support, the structure that is needed. If you're looking at the avian skeleton, what makes it so different? If you're comparing it to the mammalian, obviously it has fewer bones, but then there are just some things that are so unique in terms of the weight, in terms of the structures that provides for that ability for the bird to be able to fly or the ability for it to carry out its basic productive function or in terms of egg production or meat production. So if we look at the organization, we have the different bones making up the skull, the sternum, the vertebrae, the ribs. However, point of interest is on those bones that make the avian skeleton special. And the first there is the coracoids, which if you follow this diagram, you'll see the three arrows. The first is pointing to the S, structure of the vertebra. Then we have the coracoid here, which is linking to this shoulder bone. And then we have the sternum, which is the keel bone. So the coracoids, a pair of bones in the shoulder area, they're important for the movement of the wing, and they also provide support for the wing. So that is a very special bone because it's assisting with that flight process. For the sternum, we've seen the flightless birds, which is the ostrich, the ray, and the emu. The sternum, which you can find in your chickens, is also very crucial because it provides a large surface area, which you can see here, that would allow for the attachment of those flight muscles. And as such, both the coracoids and the sternum are important in providing support for the wings and assisting with flight. The next bones there would be the pneumatic bones, also known as hollow bones, or the medullary bones, which are seen as the spongy bones. So for the hollow bones, you would find this in the clavicle, the keel area, the pelvic girdle, the skull. And these are lighter weight bones. They are parts of the respiratory system, but then they are less dense and they play a role in the exchange of gases. For the medullary bones, these ones are likely a source of calcium for the hen because with egg formation, calcium plays a huge role, and the hen mobilizes about maybe 47% of the body's reserves of calcium just to make one egg. So bones such as the tibia, the femur, the ribs, these are the medullary bones that would assist as a source of calcium during egg formation. Having this knowledge of how the skeletal system is, how would this be important in terms of production decision making? There's this study by Bruggelams et al. 2007, and they were trying to use the bone structure to determine age. So if you work with ruminants, we have the use of teeth. You can use the tooth as a way to determine the age of maybe your sheep or your goat. But in this case, they were using the sternum to determine the age of, in this case, you have 7-week-old broilers, 14-week-old broilers, laying hens at 22 weeks, and then laying hens at 2 years old. And what's interesting there is that with increase in age, the bones become ossified. So towards here, we have for the younger birds, which is your broilers, at least half of the sternum is still showing that cartilage. But as the year progresses, especially for your laying hens, which stay for a longer time, you have most of that has been ossified. And their finding there was kind of interesting because it shows that as the age progresses, that ossification rate is also being intensified. We kind of just talked about how you can use different things, the skin pigmentation to look at egg production. But if you're looking at the skeletal system, you can use the pelvic bone to measure the abdominal capacity. And part of that would be examining the abdominal width as well as the abdominal depth. So the abdominal width is that distance between the pubic bones on the side of the vents, the side of each of the vents. And you can see 2 fingers can easily fit into that. However, for the abdominal depth is measured as the number of fingers that will fit in between the bottom of the pubic bones and the rear tip of the keel bone. So having knowledge of the width as well as the depth would help you understand the abdominal capacity of the bird. And this is an indicator of egg production. Because the abdomen, it should be wide, it should be soft, it should be expanded. The bones are supposed to be thin and flexible. That's for a good laying hen. For a non-layer, it's going to be narrow, it's going to be hard, it's going to be contracted. And the pubic bones may be thick and ridged. So in this case now, we have 2 fingers being able to fit into the width and then up to 4 fingers reaching into the depth. So this is also a way of examining egg production. The circulatory system, this is also very important, and similar to mammals, we have various key organs, the heart, the arteries, the veins, and these, the avian heart has 4 major chambers, the atrium, ventricles, both the right side and the left side. But how this translates to the metabolism or the energy demand is that for size is a very important factor there, because with the smaller size, in case of chicken, we have higher rates, whereas for the larger ones, this decreases. So this is about 45 beats per minute, whereas your chicken is having up to 475 beats per minute in terms of heart rate. So for the basal metabolism, the blood pressure is relatively higher, the metabolic rate relatively higher, body temperature, as well as heart rate. These are relatively higher for your poultry species relative to mammals. The respiratory system is also a bit similar because you have the lungs, but it's vastly different. Because unlike your mammals, your birds, they lack the diaphragm, which inflates and deflates the lungs. However, what they have is the air sacs. The air sac, they have about 9 air sacs, or 7 to 9, and these support oxygen delivery. So this image here, if you follow the blue arrow, it kind of shows this web-like protrusions here, which are specialized structures which would help in that process of air exchange and airflow through the lungs. So alongside with the lungs, they have the air sacs, which will support oxygen delivery, aid in air circulation, as well as the changes in air pressure. Body temperature regulation, I kind of mentioned earlier that the feather serves as an insulation. They don't have sweat glands, and as such, birds respond to increase in temperature in a very drastic way. So we have the thermoneutral zone, which is where they're able to maintain their body temperature and carry out normal physiological processes. This might be between 21 or in some breeds, it's as less as 17 degrees Celsius up to 24 degrees Celsius. But as the ambient temperature increases past this point, then the bird starts showing signs of discomfort, including panting, decrease in feed consumption. That consequently brings about lower egg production, body weight loss, and all those are signs, common signs of heat stress. Now, where the ability to dissipate heat exceeds the capacity of the birds, they can no longer thermoregulate, and under extreme conditions, that would result into mortality. So it's very important to, especially under now that we're having summer heat, to be able to properly monitor the body temperature of your birds and provide them with the needed resources, nutritional supplements, mineral supplements that they need to combat heat stress. For some areas, if you have an infrared thermometer, some areas, if you're trying to sample for the body temperature, would be looking at those areas that are non-feather covered. So cloacal temperature, that's the A point, or measuring from the comb, the ear area, the wattle, that will give you information because these are key areas for vasodilation activities. The feathered areas would give you information on the rates of radiation, such as maybe the wing area, the back area. But it's important to note that birds do lose heat, and 5 important ways through vasodilation, which includes the blood vessels around the comb and the wattle that helps to transfer heat from the blood to the environment, evaporation during that process of panting, radiation, convection, as well as conduction when they're in close contact with surfaces. For the excretory system, there are 3 key areas of interest there, which is the kidney, the urethra, and the cloaca. The kidney helps with removing the waste products. The urethra helps to transport that from the kidneys, and then the cloaca allows for the excretion or the exit from the body. Now, with poultry, it's important. This just shows the kidney being embedded within the rib cage. It's important to note that they don't have the bladder. So birds do not have a urinary bladder except for the ostrich and the rare. As such, the urinary product is not stored. Rather, it's being excreted as it is produced. So what we have is the excretion of protein breakdown products in the form of urate or uric acid. And for your normal chicken feces, you would see these appearing as the whitish paste on, or a whitish powder on the excreta. So the poultry, they're able to convert this ammonia to uric acid for elimination. This is also seen as an evolutionary property because it eliminates urea. They don't urinate, but then it's also effective in terms of less water wasting process for dealing with the body's excretory products. Overall, with what we've had to learn, poultry biology is pretty broad, and we've tried to touch on some of the key areas. It is important to emphasize again, because this is for small producers, that your chicken is poultry, but essentially not all poultry are your chicken, which we saw with the different poultry species that we looked at and some of their distinguishing features. More so, having a knowledge of what structures are present and how they function is important because that would help you to make the production decisions as well as managerial decisions that you need for your day-to-day operation. And this knowledge is going to support your commercial production, the welfare practices that you're employing. It will help you know when there's an abnormality and also be able to synthesize what course of action to take if something goes wrong. So these are some of the works that cited, and you can refer to them. The Poultry Extension website is a good resource. And with that, I think that's much I have to share on this. I'm trying to get through to the last slide. You can connect with the speaker. This is LinkedIn. I work at Lincoln, at least currently. And we also have a Lincoln Extension program. You can also connect with Dr. Fisher. But thank you so much for the attention and listening to our second webinar on poultry biology. And please, I would take any of your questions. Thank you.
Next week will be our poultry housing, environment, and welfare discussion. And then August 4th, we'll talk about nutrition and the digestive tract and how nutrition relates there. And then in our biosecurity and egg safety, we'll talk about some more egg health and reproductive parts.